Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual book talk with Lloyd Pratt about The Stranger's Book, The Human of African American Literature. The American Antiquarian Society is on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. Today's program is sponsored by our Program in the History of the Book in American Culture. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society, which is both a national research library and a learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in our ever-growing collection of printed and manuscript sources. The Society fosters a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and generous support of scholarship. We welcome scholars and readers from around the country and around the world, as well as right here in Worcester, to use our reading room or to seek out digitized materials on our website. Our Program in the History of the Book, which was founded in the early 1980s, sponsors talks such as today's and also sponsors summer seminars open to faculty members, graduate students, librarians, and others interested in the topic. This summer's topic is material religion, and we encourage you to check that out on our website. Throughout today's program, my colleague Amanda Kondek will post links and notes in the chat, including how to use the Q&A function to ask questions. And we do encourage you to put questions in the Q&A. And now it's a pleasure to welcome Lloyd Pratt, who is the Drew Hines Professor of American Literature and Fellow of St. John's College at the University of Oxford. I've had the pleasure of knowing Lloyd since 2000, when he enrolled in the American Antiquarian Society summer seminar in the history of the book that I team taught with Jeff Groves. Lloyd's research interests lie in 19th century American literature, African American literature, the literatures of the American South, theory and criticism, gender and sexuality, and the history of the book. He's the author of two books. The first, Archives of American Time, Literature and Modernity in the 19th Century, came out in 2010, and the book we're discussing today, The Stranger's Book, The Human of African American Literature, published by Penn Press in 2016. He's also written numerous articles in journals and anthologies. Lloyd is also a longtime researcher in the American Antiquarian Society collections, having held 2 fellowships here, including an NEH fellowship in 2009-2010, when he did much of the research for The Stranger's Book. So I'm really welcoming Lloyd Pratt back to AAS, albeit virtually. Lloyd, welcome back, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Scott. That was a very generous introduction, and thank you also for the invitation to speak today. It's been very nice to have a chance to revisit this book and also to think about whether and how it might resonate today. Much has happened since I wrote this book, both in the academic fields it seeks to engage and in the wider world. But I think it still, or at least I hope it still, speaks to questions that matter and have perhaps come to matter even more given recent events, recent as in the past 5 or so years, questions about the category of the human, about race thinking, about solidarity, about recognition, and perhaps about belonging and unbelonging. I'm especially grateful for the chance to speak even virtually at the AAS. As I say in the first line of the acknowledgments to this book would not have happened without the American Antiquarian Society. As Scott mentioned, I've been the lucky beneficiary of many hours spent in Worcester, starting with the really wonderful summer seminar that Scott mentioned, which he taught with Jeff Groves, carrying on through attendance at a second summer seminar, some fellowships, conferences, and I even had the great honor of teaching the summer seminar with Janine DeLombard. Scott and Jeff's summer seminar was my first introduction to book history. I was a graduate student at Brown at the time, and it was, as I think the seminar was always intended to be, a kind of gateway to a new intellectual world for me. I think it's also fair to say, and some of the people who may be listening can say might agree with me about this, it's fair to say that the summer seminar and the American Antiquarian Society has profoundly reshaped 19th century American and African American literary studies. When I think about the most influential work being produced in this area, so much of it can be traced to time spent in Worcester. I haven't been to Worcester in a while, but I'm eager to see the transformation and the expansion of the building when I do manage to get there. travel's been a little difficult. Today, I'm going to begin with an outline of where I'm going to take you in the next half hour or so. I'll open with two things that I think of. This is my outline, and then I'll get to the actual thing itself. So I'll open with two things that I think of as the main points of origin for this book. The first is a problem with petition, and the second is Frederick Douglass's career-long interest in the figure of the stranger. So the first issue, the issue of petition, is signaled in the book's dedication, which reads, "To the Katrina people, those who made it, those who did not." Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath had a significant influence on my thinking and my scholarship, and that impact is registered in the dedication and in the preface to the book. In just a moment, I'll explain what I saw happening in the aftermath of Katrina that gave me pause and made me revisit the problem of an historical and ongoing tendency, I think, to refigure Black address to the world as though it were a petition to the world. So more on that in just a moment. Then I'm going to read out and gloss as I do a couple of paragraphs from the introduction to the book to sketch out its largest arguments. To put it very simply, I think the Black men's writing I work with in this book is trying to fashion a revised version of humanism that centers on understanding humans as always strangers to each other. So that may sound fairly anodyne, predictable, and perhaps a little existentialist in its leanings, although Black existentialism is very much a question in the kind of public and intellectual realm right now. But I think there was something important being argued and enacted by this writing that we can learn from now, even if we do not decide to adopt it as a political practice in the present. I thought I'd then turn to the second point of origin for the book, which is the specific case of Frederick Douglass's interest in the figure of the stranger, and a quotation from Psalms that he cites in a public letter to William Lloyd Garrison, and around which the second chapter of my book, and really the whole book, pivots. What I'm going to suggest, and what I suggest there, is that Douglass's lifelong and evolving interest in the figure of the stranger also allows me to talk about what I see as the critical context for thinking about strangerhood in this period, and which inform the broader historical and literary analysis of the book. So the first of these contexts is the debate over slavery, which often turned on two competing biblical, Levitical understandings of who counts as a stranger and how the stranger should be treated. The second context for thinking about strangerhood that informs the book is a historical and still enduring theoretical view, a sociological view, that suggests the experience of modern life is an experience of life lived among strangers. So if there's adequate time, I'll move to give a quick overview of the chapters, focusing on how the text discussed around each chapter. But I thought I would try to end, and I may skip the chapters just to be able to do this. I wanted to end by talking a bit about some of the serendipitous archival revelations I encountered at the AAS and elsewhere, including the Antebellum Strangers book that gives my book its title. As you might have noticed, there is no possessive apostrophe in the title of my book. Neither was there in the historical Strangers book that inspired the title and about which I talk in the final chapter of the book. I'll explain more toward the end about why that lack of an apostrophe, that lack of a possessive relationship to a book might matter. So let me start with the dedication of the book and the preface. I grew up in New Orleans. As anyone who knows me knows, I was deeply affected by growing up there, and my family's still there. So I was acutely tuned in as the events unfolded there during and after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. Now, as anyone who was around or has paid attention will know, there were many disturbing things that happened during that event, most of which, or many of which, I watched unfold online in real time from New York, where I was living at the time. But I found myself thinking long and hard about one particularly, to me, disturbing, appropriative, and ultimately, I would say, violent gesture in the media coverage of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Now, as you may remember, much of the imagery that emerged from the aftermath of Katrina fell easily into the category of what Saidiya Hartman famously describes as scenes of subjection. These are images of Black people being submitted to pain and often torture that are ostensibly produced for the purpose of securing white sympathy and aid, but which ultimately end up reproducing a hierarchical relation in which the white sympathizer and the Black object of sympathy remain forever locked into a relationship that only really ultimately supports the white sympathizer's sense of their own humanity. Now, one interesting consequence of the summer of 2020 is that the broad outlines of Hartman's argument are much more widely available in public culture. And while there's not, I would say, adequate attention to the problem of reproducing such images, there is at least a broader consciousness of what might be going wrong. In 2005, this was much less the case, at least among the white liberals in charge of US television network coverage and newspaper publication. So one thing that struck me about the specific iteration of this problem that emerged in the aftermath of Katrina was how often photographic and video images of Black prayer directed at God were being turned into images of Black petition, images that were then co-opted to stand in for the general population of New Orleans. In one especially disturbing example that I talk about in the book, when it first returned to print, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, which is, as many people will know, a sort of storied newspaper from the city of New Orleans, published an image of a Black woman kneeling in prayer in New Orleans. But the paper actually co-opted her words, her supposedly overheard words, "Help us, please." And it redeployed those words as the new newspaper's headline. So the cover of the Times-Picayune, I don't reproduce the actual image because I don't think it's appropriate to reproduce the actual image, but the cover of the Times-Picayune was a picture of this woman praying, and then this headline, "Help us, please." Now, in this moment of cagey ventriloquism, a Black prayer was recaptured and then reframed as though it were the property of the paper and the city of New Orleans, who then spoke to a broader national public for some form of rescue. What I found so disturbing about this image was how it simultaneously disrespected the integrity of the scene of prayer, the kind of, the sacrosanct nature of that moment, and then repurposed it in a way that ended up displacing the woman who was praying. There were many images such as this one, and I started thinking about the long history of white or majority white media outlets in the US, dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries, refiguring moments such as this one, moments of prayer or intimacy between Black people or some other form of semi-private communication addressed to each other, or potentially addressed to a wider community or a wider public, refiguring those as though they were public property, and also as they were in fact scenes of Black people petitioning white people for help, or more often for simple recognition of their humanity. So the first thing that I really wanted to do with the book, and the reason I start with a preface that discusses the image from the Times-Picayune, and a first chapter focused on how African-American writers insisted on the self-evidence of their humanity without petitioning for it, I wanted to firmly, fully, and permanently set aside the idea that every instance, at least permanently in the context of what I was doing, that every instance of public Black utterance of this kind should be understood as an act of petition aimed at white people. I wanted to do this because I wanted to open a space in which I could discuss and work through what was actually going on in various moments in antebellum American writing when Black men addressed some version of a public. To do that, I needed to take the question of petition off the table. What I ended up arguing once that had been accomplished is captured in the first pages of the book's introduction. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to read a few lines from those first few pages, a couple of paragraphs. They're a bit tightly argued, so I'll also stop and gloss them as I go, because I think that being read to from an academic book can be difficult. So I'll try to give you a sense of what I think I was saying. So the title of the introduction is actually Print and the Human. I begin, "The Stranger's book uses the occasion of two bodies of writing to clarify the relation between entering into print and acquiring a human profile in a specific time and place. It does so by making clear the transformative work undertaken by a group of African-American men who were committed to reframing the meaning of the human. They also sought to make participation in their revised category of the human more widely available than had been the case in earlier and different humanisms. The first body of writing consists of Frederick Douglass's editorials, correspondence, addresses, lectures, and autobiographies. The second is the antebellum criticism and poetry of a circle of francophone free men of color who wrote in New Orleans. Although Douglass's name attaches to the first body of writing, it will become clear in the book, in what I argue, how this writing was as much a group performance as was that created by the free men of color responsible for Les Cenelles, Choix, poésies, indigènes. The latter is an early anthology of African American literature, and it was published in New Orleans in the same year as Douglass's narrative, 1845. The writing in Les Cenelles, it both is collective and is not, a quality that exemplifies the overall thrust of my argument, which insists on the presence of given and proper names in the context of an arguably coterie publication. So just to gloss that quickly, the key thing that I was trying to get at is that I think that in this writing, in the writing that Douglass and his compatriots are producing, and in the writing that this group of francophone men in New Orleans, free men of color, are producing, I think that there is actually an attempt to rethink what it might mean to belong to human, to belong to the broader range of humanity, and not just for people of African descent, but to actually fundamentally rethink or refigure what it might be to be a human being, any one of us. And so I think that there's a kind of ambition and a kind of political, theoretical, and philosophical ambition about this writing that has sometimes been underplayed and underconsidered. I think that there's a level of claim that's going on in the writing that's profound and that's really important to think about. Okay. So I'm going to skip forward just a little bit, because I also wanted to say something about this paragraph that comes on the second page of the book, because I think it especially relates to the program in the history of the book and American culture. And I feel like this is the moment where my experience at the Antiquarian Society, and especially my experience in the various seminars that I was part of, really came to bear. So a little bit later, when I talk a bit more about the version of humanism being offered in the writing from this period that I'm interested in, I sort of associate that with the views of Edward Glissant, who many people will know, who has a very famous essay from 1990 called Pour l'opacité, so for opacity. And there Glissant writes, to feel in solidarity with the other, it is not necessary for me to grasp him. In the French, the verb is apprendre, so there's a sense of it's possible to know and to relate to without grabbing at, apprehending in that sense. So then I say, I want to identify two features of these antebellum African American men's stranger humanism that differentiate it from other humanisms. On the one hand, the literary and formal practices adopted in the writing of these men indicate the centrality of multi-party disclosure and multi-party witness to their vision of stranger humanism. On the other hand, the organizing practices of these men acknowledge that in order for stranger humanism to function as it should, the right material conditions must be in place in order to support such disclosure and witness. So the first part, which is not exactly to do with the Antiquarian Society or the history of the book, but the first part is really to try to emphasize the fact that although people like Douglass and other writers like him, men from this period, men of African descent from this period, have often been associated with a kind of liberal individualist ethos that gets connected to dominant white norms and gets connected to a kind of oppressive culture, an androcentrism that is understood to permeate across a sort of liberal individualist version of democracy into African American culture. Although that is something that's worth thinking about, it also seems to me that for Douglass, for the people who are writing with and sometimes against him or alongside him, for the people he was in dialogue with in his newspapers, as well as for this group of Francophone men in New Orleans, there's a sense in which what they're looking at is a world in which we're not talking about one person recognizing another. We're not talking about one person coming into contact with their own sense of self. We're actually talking about this kind of curious multi-party recognition where a group of people have to be engaged with each other in order for something like the human or the individual to come into being. Now, the second part is the more history of the book part of it. So I said, as you know, the organizing practices of these men acknowledge that in order for stranger humanism to function as it should, the right material conditions must be in place in order to support such disclosure and witness. I don't think that I mean this strictly, and I say this here, I'll say in just a moment, I don't mean that sense of material conditions must be in place. I don't mean that only in terms of economic priority, economic wherewithal. I mean that very literally in terms of things like, as I say here, these men consider that that African American men must have access not only to appropriate rhetorical constructions, but also to the right physical formats, book formats, literal rooms, periodical formats in which to pursue that multi-party recognition. So as I work my way through the book, one of the things that my book, not their book, as I work my way through my book, one of the things that I'm trying to keep in mind is how does the kind of overarching possibility of what is often probably improperly called print culture facilitate a particular version of humanism. So that's the big argument, if you will. That's the kind of overarching sense of things. As I said before, the thing I want to do now is I want to turn to something that happens in the second chapter, which is Frederick Douglass's use of a particular passage from Psalms. So in a public letter to William Lloyd Garrison, and this is before he had his famous break with Garrison, Douglass is addressing Garrison. He's also addressing the audience of readers. And in this moment, he quotes Psalm 39:12. And it's the final line of what I'm about to read. This is from Douglass. He says in this letter, which has been published in The Liberator in 1846, it's a letter from Belfast, where he is at the time he writes, "I have no end to serve, no creed to uphold, no government to defend, and as to nation, I belong to none. I have no protection at home or resting place abroad. The land of my birth welcomes me to her shores only as a slave and spurns with contempt the idea of treating me differently, so that I am an outcast from the society of my childhood and an outlaw in the land of my birth. I am a stranger with thee," in quotation marks, this is from the Psalm, "I am a stranger with thee and a sojourner as all my fathers were." So here, and I'll just read what I end up saying, quoting Psalm 39:12, Douglass adopts a form of oblique and divided address whose tripart target is Garrison, God, and the implied reader, the liberator. "I am a stranger with thee and a sojourner as all my fathers were." Douglass's account of his own strangerhood initially channels the voice of the modern literary stranger, and at the same time echoes the Bible's account of Levitical strangerhood, which I'll talk about in a moment. This driving iteration of strangerhood next seems to mount toward a climactic account of Douglass's absolute alienation. In the end, however, the psalm functions as a coda that refigures what has come before. It indicates that our mutual humanity renders us permanent mutual strangers. As it turns out, moreover, strangerhood is the ground of our mutuality. I am a stranger with thee. That with is vitally important. Reformulating the psalmist's address to God, Douglass identifies strangerhood as a shared human condition. In a way, I say reformulate, in a way, one could argue that that was always there, and that that's one of the powers of bringing that psalm into play. Now, the reason that that moment is so important in Douglass's writing is that he's actually intervening in a larger debate that's been ongoing in this period, as well as providing something that we might want to look at in order to rethink our notions of what modernity brings about in terms of strangers. So the period debate that's really important to what he's saying there, and those of you who know this period and know the history of slavery and pro-slavery and anti-slavery will know that there were two moments in Leviticus that were very important to the Bible, what was called the Bible debate over slavery. So one of them is Leviticus 19:34, which reads, but this is from the King James Version, which would have been the one best known to Americans. It reads, "But the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt." So for anti-slavery activists, abolitionists, mainly white, but some Black abolitionists as well, referred to this passage. But for many anti-slavery white abolitionists, this was a key argument for why slavery was wrong. The sense was that this passage endorsed the notion that people of African descent, though they may be strangers, they deserve hospitality. I mean, there's a double bind already built into that, which is that they are not addressed or understood by way of that logic as part of the same community of the human. They're understood as strangers. Nevertheless, for anti-slavery activists, that was a key argument to be able to make, that the Bible says we must treat these strangers with hospitality. However, there was an ongoing debate that actually focused in response at another moment in Leviticus. And so this is Leviticus 25, verses 44 and 45. So there, Leviticus commands, according to these pro-slavery activists, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. So for me, one of the reasons that moment, when I first read that moment in Douglass talks about the stranger across his writings, but when I first read that particular letter and I started thinking about that stranger with the moment, the fact that Douglass doesn't go to either of the two famous passages from Leviticus that are meant to be the ones that talk about slavery and strangerhood, that in fact he goes to a verse from Psalms, that seemed important. And it was important because he seemed to be trying to relocate the debate about strangerhood and Black people away from this debate about either you get hospitality or you get enslavement. Well, hospitality is a sorry bargain in the end, because it always means you're dependent upon the host. I suppose it's better than the other option, which is slavery. But Douglass is very clear here that we need a different way to talk about what it means to be a stranger in the context of the United States in this period as a Black man. I also think it's a moment where it starts to become clear that what Douglass is saying is that this is a condition that all human beings share in common. And the oddity of it is that it's not a condition that's about being obvious to others. It's not a condition about being the same as other people. It's actually a condition that involves being unknown to them, to have people be unsure about you, to have people not exactly know their relation to you. So for me, that was a key thing that Douglass was doing, was to try to think about the complexity of this category of the stranger. The other thing that I talk about in relation to Douglass and in relation to this debate over the stranger is something that's come in from the I'll respond. I just saw a question come up. I'll come back to that when we get to the Q&A. It's a good question. The thing that comes up in the account of this period that's very popular, which is it's the sort of locus classicus, academic locus classicus for this argument, is Karen Haltunen's Confidence Men and Painted Women, where she picks up an argument that is largely a sociological argument and a very famous one. And the idea is that one of the main things that happened in the shift from the pre-modern to the modern period is that people went from living among people whom they knew and were related to sort of kith and kin, to living among people the majority of the people they lived among, they didn't actually know. So there's this sense that there's this radical transformation that happens, and depending on which scholar, which historian you ask, modernity either started in the 17th century or we're just starting it now. It's not quite clear. In any event, there's a conventional argument that says with the advent of modernity, strangers started to be everywhere. Now, it's an interesting argument. It has its merits and it has its kind of power. But one of the things that I started thinking about was the fact that it presumes that there's only one type of stranger that's being created. There's only one type of strangerhood that's coming into being with this transition toward modernity that's being described. From my perspective, and as I started looking through archival materials, especially when I was at the Antiquarian Society, but also digital materials that were online, things at the Nantucket Athenaeum, things at the Mass Historical Society, the library company, one of the things that kept coming back to me was that there's actually a huge apparatus of materials that ends up defining what it means to be a stranger. And there are very kind of complicated categorizations and distinctions that get made that suggest that while there may be strangers, they're not all the same kind of strangers. And while there may be some kind of transition that's happening, it's not a sort of simple, rising line of strangerhood. If you go that route, you miss the nuances in what's going on. And you miss the fact that some strangers are simply people who arrived from some other place, and some strangers are people who deserve enslavement. So I was trying to break down that notion that there was a simple transition from no strangers to strangers and rethink, in fact, the idea that maybe there were different kinds of beings, different kinds of strangers being created every day. So in terms of what I want to do now, I'm trying to see how long I've been talking. So I think that I'll just go briefly through the chapters of the book. I'll just kind of do a quick gloss of these because I think that it might be more interesting to hear about some of the things that I found when I was digging around in various places. So the first chapter, as I briefly mentioned in my opening comments, is a chapter that's called The Making of Self-Evidence. And that looks at the main text for that chapter are Andrew Jackson's 2 addresses to the free colored inhabitants of Louisiana, which is from 1814, William Lloyd Garrison's Thoughts on African Colonization from 1837, and the Colored National Convention of 1853's Address to the People of the United States. And what I look at there is the fact that in Andrew Jackson's original address to the free colored inhabitants of Louisiana, where he was basically trying to recruit free men of color to agree to serve, to fight the British, there's a moment in the address to the free colored inhabitants of Louisiana where he addresses them as people who owe a debt to the nation because their lives have not been destroyed by the accession of Louisiana to the United States. So there's an implication that there is a kind of not only personal obligation to enroll in the military at this point, there's even a kind of ongoing debt burden. And as a number of theorists in African-American studies have often pointed out, that idea that Black people owe something to the state beyond just simply being part of it is a common thing. What ends up happening later, and what I find really interesting, is that that address to the free colored inhabitants of Louisiana from Andrew Jackson actually gets taken up by the descendant of free people of color in Louisiana as a kind of key text talking about their history. And it's understood to really be this kind of certification of who they are as human beings. One important thing that happens, though, is that they actually often reprint that text, the broadside version of it that was reprinted in newspapers. However, they delete that specific line that references the idea of a debt that must be paid by service, a debt that must be paid to the state. So in that deletion, in a way, what I try to say is that they're making a claim for their self-evidence without actually claiming it. They're simply assuming it and deleting the thing from the past that is inappropriately suggesting that a debt is owed. So chapters 2 and 3 take up the question of what sort of idea of the human is offered in this writing. I said a bit about chapter 2 on Douglass's Stranger with Thee. In chapter 3, I focus on the volume I mentioned at the beginning, the volume Les Cenelles. One of the things that I try to think about there is really the sociality of life in 19th century free people of color communities in New Orleans. I try to think about the way that the text, this collection of poetry circulated within that community, also the way that it reaches outward toward France and to other parts of the United States, and the way that it's in dialogue. There's a kind of internal dialogue within the volume itself. And there's also a dialogue with other texts in other places, including the fact that at the beginning of each poem in that collection, there's a reference to a tune to which the poem should be read or sung, which is a feature of the chansonnier from France, largely from Paris. But there's a chansonnier that's actually produced in New Orleans that was probably used to work through this. I should say Michael Winship helped me think a lot about the kind of print qualities of Les Cenelles when I was working on it. So then in chapter 4, the other thing in that chapter that's important is that I try to talk about the way that, and this is why the stuff about multi-party disclosure, the fact that there are these dialogues, I talk about the way that those poems are very invested in what we would traditionally think of as lyric voice. So the voice of a lyric poem, for those who are not literary scholars and who don't think about these things all the time, the voice of the lyric poem is supposed to be able to animate the world. And it's often understood to issue from an individual. And it's often understood to give that individual voice, the possessor of that individual voice, power. It's not understood to be a conversation. And one of the things that I try to suggest in this chapter is that there's a more interesting version of lyric that is about dialogue and response that these men are working with. Chapter 4 focuses on the writing of African American and African diasporic history as a site of loss and archival inadequacy. So one of the key and most important arguments, probably the past 30 years of African American studies, has been to try to think about the way that the exclusion of African Americans from access to printed material, this probably goes back 50 years now, exclusion of African Americans from access to printed material and access to literacy meant that they often appear only as records. So one of the famous instances of this is when Frederick Douglass talks about the fact that his birth and death date he doesn't know. The only way that he appears is as an entry in a list of chattel slavery. So what I end up saying in this chapter is that there's something very important about that argument. I think that also, and this I think is a particularly literary critical problem that needs to be addressed. Within literary studies, more conventional literary studies, there's actually a kind of deep investment in what cannot be said, or what can only be gestured to, or what can be alluded to but not spoken. That emphasis on the importance of what can't be said, I think, and I try to argue, may have tilted the kind of facticity of a compromised archive into a place where at least literary scholars have occasionally been more interested in discovering what's not being said than what's actually there. And so I try to talk a little bit about how much there actually is by way of archival materials. And I do that through a very important novel from the from 2003, Edward P. Jones's The Known World. I won't give away the big moment in that novel, but I recommend it to everyone. The Known World has a really key revelation that happens near the end of the book that suggests that that sense of inadequacy might be misplaced. The other thing that's important is that that book itself is very interested in the difficulty of trying to think about what it means to engage with the archive or archival materials if you are interested in the history of African Americans. It's very much about the compromised nature of archival documents in relation to Black history. So then in the final book, the final chapter, which is called How to Read a Stranger's Book, I look at these two different documents, and I'll talk about the Stranger's Book from the Nantucket Athenaeum. Then that will allow me to switch into what I said I was going to do before, which is to talk a little bit about the archival stuff. So those of you who know Douglass will know that one of his first famous sort of speeches to a largely white audience was at the 1841 Nantucket Anti-Slavery Convention, which took place at the Nantucket Athenaeum. Douglass went back to the Nantucket Athenaeum many times, and he spoke there many times after his famous speech there. It's also the case that the Nantucket Athenaeum, like many Athenea in the early 19th century, and I don't know if the Antiquarian Society still does this, but when I was there, they certainly did it. There was a book, and when you entered, you had to sign in at the desk. And if you weren't a member of the society of the Nantucket Athenaeum, if you weren't a sort of paying shareholder in the Nantucket Athenaeum, you actually had to sign a book that on the cover was called The Stranger's Book. And so The Stranger's Book was anyone who came to the Athenaeum, was introduced as a guest. They had to be understood and recorded as a stranger. So the reason that there's no apostrophe is that it's not about a book that's owned by a stranger. It's about a book that is comprising all the strangers who have visited. One of the things that I noticed, and this artifact was kind of brought to my attention by my mother-in-law, who was the director of the Nantucket Athenaeum for 10 years. I was talking to her about this project as I was working on it, and she just sort of said, The Stranger's Book. So I looked at The Stranger's Book. Douglass's name doesn't appear anywhere in The Stranger's Book, even though he came there many times. Emerson's name appears there. Thoreau's name appears there. There are many people who appear there. Douglass's name doesn't appear there. So I started thinking about what it means to cross the threshold of a building and to have to sign a book or not sign a book that addresses you as a stranger. And so I went back to the Athenaeum Strangers book, started thinking about it. And then I also looked at something from New Orleans, which is a document that was produced after New Orleans, as did many of the southern states started doing, regulating the movements and the presence of free people of color in New Orleans. It's a register of free people of color in New Orleans, and it sort of documents their lives in detail. And I started trying to think about, what do you do with these documents that are on their face so objectionable? And I started trying to read the details of that document to think about what kind of story could be told by the notation, which is a horrendous notation in some ways because it's meant to identify the physical presence of a person. The notation that one particular free man of color has a crucifix on his arm, tattooed. And what about the fact that that particular man is also testified to by a white priest? What's the relationship that's being described there? So in that final chapter, I tried to think in a little more detail about what you do with these kinds of documents, what you do with them to kind of elicit something more than absence from them. So I think I'll stop there. I've been talking for a while, a little over 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. And maybe if Scott comes back in, I think he might have some questions for me. I also see that there are some questions on the side, and I'll move my little stand that I had here.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. This is a wonderful book, and it's as much an archival work of archival discovery as it is a kind of thought piece about what we mean by strangers and how we can know one another or can't know one another. It got me thinking. I'm a historian by training and by scholarship in many ways, and I'm intrigued by this notion of the tension between imagining people in the past as strangers, which in a sense, people in the past always are to us, while in some sense, the work of I'm doing the work, or historians do the work of trying to know them or know something of them. I think, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but as you suggest, Douglass is identifying the universality of strangeness to one another, being a stranger with me, not I'm a stranger to you, but we are each strangers to one another on some fundamental level. Where does that lead? Can that lead to throwing up our hands and saying, well, we can't know one another? Or could it lead in Douglass's mind or in our work as scholars to a sense of at once accepting our mutual strangerness while also recognizing one another's humanity and trying to understand one another better, knowing the strangerness? I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I was wrestling with as I was reading the book.
No, Scott, that's exactly one of the main things that I was wrestling with as I was writing the book. And so I think that there are actually two questions, and I could talk about them differently. One is the question about the idea of the historical person in the past as the stranger, and one is a kind of more philosophical question, which I think is a question that these men are really working with. So I don't think it's presentist to imagine that this is a concern of theirs. So the question about relating to the past or people in the past as strangers, as Scott knows because he's read the book, there's a moment at the end of the book where and especially in that final chapter, where I try to think about that difficulty of what is the complication of trying to know the past at the same time, and especially when you're dealing with figures who were not fully enfranchised in their own period, when the past's version of itself can't fully be heard. I don't think in relation to the historical question, the historical strangers, the people in the past, I don't think that we throw up our hands in relation to that. What I think and what I try to argue in the book, and I realize that this is a kind of tricky argument to make, but it's something that I try to say, is that I'm perfectly happy with the idea that we engage with people in the past, that we try to understand them through what they have left us, through what they present us. While at the same time, I would like to be able to say that we have to understand that those people in the past become something different as the present unfolds. So the example that I give is something like, if you think about the men and the women who are documented in that book from New Orleans that's registering the free people of color of New Orleans. The people that they were are the people who they were. That is something that is there. It's also the case that the people who they were and the meaningfulness of who they were changes at the moment that Plessy v. Ferguson happens, which is a story of New Orleans, as people know who know that case. It changes when Katrina happens. It changes when Obama is elected. So I think that the people in the past, they deserve their integrity, but in a way, I want to also keep open the idea that who they are, maybe some of their successes, maybe some of their achievements are actually things that happen in the present. And in a way, they deserve to be able to come into conversation with that present. So the other thing that you were asking was about, the possibility of understanding each other and accepting our strangers to each other. I think that this is something that Douglass is interested in. I think that this is something that the Les Cenelles poets are interested in. I think that it is a possibility. I think that, and this is, again, to go back to the sort of history of the book aspect of this and the question of materiality in relation to this, I think it's a possibility. I think it's also a possibility that can only be realized with ongoing transformations to the structures that make our encounters with each other possible and the structures that kind of shelter our encounters with each other. So the fact that the AAS is doing what it's doing now means that it's a very different institution from what it was 150 years ago. It means that the kind of encounters that two strangers might have under the generous dome, those are very different encounters that would have been possible 150 years ago. So I think that one of the things that these African-American men are asking for and kind of enjoining us to think about is, what are the structures, the kind of literal physical structures that need to be in place that will make an authentic encounter possible, that will make something like a capacity to respect the other's right to a capacity possible. I don't think we're there yet, but I do think that that's part of the project, is figuring out, yes, I do think that stranger encounters are possible. I think that productive stranger encounters are possible. I think that that's what these men want. I think they're also very attentive to the fact that that's not something that can happen just in the realm of the imagination. There are actually buildings and laws and structures and police and guns and things that regulate whether we can have a just stranger encounter in the present.
And I'm looking at the Q&A. Caroline Schimmel, as we were having that conversation, asks, how does this relate with the parallel historical inquiry, Am I Not a Man?
Yeah, Caroline, thank you for that question. In fact, one of the things that I say in the image that I was talking about, the one that was on the cover of the Times-Picayune, one of the things that was so disturbing to me about it is that it, in essence, replicates that "Am I not a man and a brother" image, the kneeling enslaved person, and so it was deeply disturbing to me that it was so accessible, that framing, the photographer, whether he or she knew what he or she was doing, the framing was so accessible. The kind of visioning of "Am I not a man" was so easy to access at that moment. And one of the things that I say at the end of the preface to the book is that there were other options available. African-American people have been producing other options other than that for centuries now. And the fact that there was this kind of immediate, I don't know, I don't want to be too harsh on the photographer because I'm sure they were trying to do something, but there was a kind of habituated response that had to frame it in terms of, am I not a man and a brother? When what should have been the response was, there's another citizen of the United States. We're not in 1840. We don't need that kind of 18th century British abolition image to recirculate in order to get the government to turn up and take care of the people in New Orleans. But it's an excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah. David Zilka asks a historical question. Why did Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison fall out with each other?
That is a very good question. And It's actually something I'm working on right now. So I have an answer to this question, luckily. So the reason that Garrison and Douglass fell out with each other, besides the fact that Garrison was in his own way a benevolent racist, I'm sure that that was a large part of it. One of the main things that, and people who know this period know this, one of the big debates was the question of whether the Constitution of the United States did or did not endorse slavery. So Douglass was originally aligned with Garrison in the view that there should be no union with slaveholders, and that the Constitution of the United States needed to be torn up, tossed out, and we needed to restart, because there was a sense that the Constitution had been structured in a way that made slavery not only possible but even necessary and at the core of what it meant to be the United States. Eventually, Douglass would come to the view that a lot of other abolitionists in this period shared, especially white abolitionists, that in fact, the Constitution, in his view, did not endorse slavery. And he ends up talking about what he describes as the necessity, and legal scholars were saying this in the period, the necessity of a plain reading of the Constitution. And according to Douglass's plain reading of the Constitution, which is a kind of a legal category of plain reading. According to Douglass's plain reading of the Constitution, the word slave never appears. Therefore, slavery was not endorsed by the original document. People now, and many people then, would say, but the intentions of the framers were to make enslavement possible. So they might not have said slavery, but everybody knew what they were talking about. What Douglass ends up saying, and it's interesting and complex to think about this because, you know, Douglass is such a hero for Clarence Thomas. What Douglass ends up saying is the Constitution was drafted in a closed room. The intentions of the founders were not meant to be made public. People did publicize what they were, or what people thought they were later, but in fact, the Constitution was intended to be a document that everyone could read and that everyone could share, and that should not be the province strictly of legal minds. And also the fact that the Constitution had to be validated by the state legislatures meant that the intentions of the framers, whether they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery, should not be considered in this debate. And so Douglass basically joins the people who say, all right, we're going to take the Constitution away from the slaveholders. That was the main point of departure between Garrison and Douglass. It had been building for a while and for good reasons, but yeah.
Thanks. Paul Erickson asks, can you talk a bit about the notion of the stranger that you explore in the book and processes of estrangement that work in the mid-19th century? I'm thinking, he writes, particularly of the enforced separation of families under slavery, but also about the frequent long-term separation of friends and families through 4-year whaling voyages or travel to the gold fields in California, experiences that could have rendered people who were once close strangers to one another.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Paul. So I think that this is important to think about because as I was suggesting with the relation to the Karen Haltunen argument, yeah. I think that one of the key things that gets lost when we try to talk about the stranger in this period is, in fact, the idea that there might be more than one kind of strangerhood coming into being. And I think Paul's question really highlights this. So while it might be the case, for me, immediately I see, 4-year whaling voyages, I see long-term separation, and I think Middle Passage. And I think about the fact that there was this kind of enforced genealogical isolation that Orlando Patterson famously talks about, where people from the same communities in Africa were mixed with each other in the Barracudas in the Caribbean. So there was a kind of stranger making that went on there. But I think Paul has pointed to the fact that there are other experiences of being displaced, of being moved around voluntarily or involuntarily that affected similar kinds of relationships. One of the things that's interesting to me about Douglass is that I think that he's keyed into the fact that more and more people are in fact becoming some version of a stranger. And I think that he's actually trying to exploit that and say, this is a direction we're all going. Let's think about what it would mean to embrace this category and really make it into something more politically generative rather than just exclusive and exclusionary.
Yeah. Kate McLaughlin asks, is respecting opacity slash strangerliness, as Douglass conceptualizes it, a form of anti-intellectualism, a lack of empathy? Does it matter if it is?
Thanks, Kate. That's a very helpful question. I think that it's not anti-intellectualism. I think that it's actually a position that's being articulated from a kind of philosophical understanding that having access to the other is not always the same thing as having respect for the other, and that there is a kind of imposing presence of familiarity that is something that is very much a part of what people of African descent experience and continue to experience in the United States. Even things like touching people's hair, thinking that you can touch someone's child, thinking that you can take someone's child. So I think that there's a very clear theoretical, philosophical background to what Douglass is doing, where he wants to push back against that idea that intimacy is always a good thing. Access and intimacy are always a good thing. I think that he's not opposed to it. I think that he's actually trying to present a kind of, as I say in the book, a set of rules where familiarity can develop, but strangerhood has to always be the ground. The presumption that we can know other people in their entirety, I think he would reject. I think from his perspective, the only being that knows anyone in their entirety is God.
Najia Khaled says, if I understand correctly, you mentioned the possibility of trying to recognize or respect the thought that goes into a certain rhetorical / political strategy at the same time as critiquing it or declining to use it in our own moment. I was wondering how you envision the role of academia or the internet or any other medium in navigating that kind of critique. Does any medium predispose us to a certain response?
That is a very good question. Thanks, Najia. So you're right. You did understand me correctly. The possibility of trying to recognize or respect the thought that goes into a certain rhetorical political strategy at the same time as critiquing it or declining to use it in our own moment. So as I said in the very introductory thing that I was talking about, I do think that Douglass is trying to think about a rhetorical structure and physical structures and material structures that would make it possible to engage with each other in a different way. I also think that it's possible that that might not work in this current moment, because I think that, as Najia's question suggests, we are in a different material moment to the degree that Twitter was not a thing, Instagram was not a thing, and like it or detest it, it is actually one of the major ways that people, especially during lockdowns here and in the United States, I don't even know if you guys had lockdowns at any point, but lockdowns here, it was actually a major way that people came into contact with questions about Black life. And so I think that that issue is very important to consider. And you ask about the role of academia or the internet in navigating that kind of critique. I think that you've detected something that I'm trying to get at, and I didn't read this part where I talk about the semi-private room. I think one of the really important things that Douglass and the Les Cenelles poets are trying to get at that we can think about now is how we need to construct structures that have rules for engagement. One of the things that I think is very difficult about contemporary social media is that there aren't a lot of good rules. And that is supposed to be the pleasure of it, but I also question somehow whether it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Thank you.
Jacqueline Goldsby says, thanks for this exciting, bold framework. I'm wondering about gender and stranger humanism. You've been careful to specify Black men's writing as your source material for stranger humanism's philosophical claims. Can you speak to how Black women's writing of the era contributed to strangerhood's conceptual insights and circulation?
Thank you, Jackie, for that. Yeah, I was very careful when I was writing the book to try to specify that this was a group of men who were trying to talk to each other. It gets a bit complicated because they end up talking less to and about women. And there are also moments in the book where I try to talk about the fact that there is a kind of androcentric bent to at least some of the writing that I think ends up being an issue for both of them and also for their understanding of strangerhood. I think that in terms of African-American women's writing, there are two places that I would think about it. and this goes back to kind of recur to the thing I was saying about the preface to in the preface to the book, where I talk about that image from the cover of the New Orleans Times-Picayune. As I said, one of the things that I found most offensive and difficult about that image was the way that it refused to respect the scene of prayer. And so for me, one of the key things to think about would be understanding how people like Joanna Lee, Mariah Stewart, women and other women preachers in the 19th century were establishing a relationship to God that was very front and center in the way that they presented themselves to the world, and how that capacity to talk to God directly rather than through some kind of intermediary actually gave them a different base, if you will, in relation to the rest of the world, so that there was not an obligation to put forward the same sense of availability of Black life. I think the other place that I would go is to talk about the moment in Jacobs's incidents in the life of the slave girl. It's sort of an easy place to go, but I think it's an important thing to do. That introduction to the book, where she talks about the difficulty of essentially not wanting to present this. And I think that she is pushing at a similar notion. And I think that one of the things that she talks about when she talks about the kind of invasion of her mother's household is that kind of overbearing sense of availability of Black life to white people. And so I think that she's pointing to, in that book, a lack of access to the capacity of engaging a kind of stranger personality. I think that the question of the degree to which Black women writers during this period were facilitating, expanding that range of strangerhood is something that I need to return to and to think more about.
And that puts me in mind of Tara Bynum's recent book, Reading Pleasures, new book, Reading Pleasures, in which she reads the correspondence between Phyllis Wheatley Peters and her friend Obor Tanner, and makes the point that was between them. It wasn't meant to be sort of public. It wasn't meant to be about the gaze of white people. It was really about their intimate relationship and friendship, and that's a kind of different kind of address than we often imagine. I'm gonna add one more question from an anonymous attendee, because we are closing on our end time here. I'm sorry. What role do non-human animals have in this stranger humanism, particularly if one considers that the human is an artifice?
I think the answer is that they don't. It might be nicer to say that they do, but I don't see that being a particularly important aspect of what, at least from their perspective, of what these men are writing about. I think one of the things that is interesting and that is worth more consideration is the degree to which the non-human, non-animal, alive world plays a role in the writing of these men. So Les Cenelles, the title of that volume, Les Cenelles, Choix, poésies, indigènes, one of the only extant copies is at the Antiquarian Society. The title of that is actually referencing a specific berry that grows in the swamps around New Orleans, and the way that it was exchanged as a gift among free women and men of African descent in New Orleans. And if you think about Douglass's writing, the encounters with the swamp, the number of times that he talks about the kind of the trees, the kind of the landscape around him, I think it's a key question to start to think about what is the relation of these men and of the stranger, not just to the non-human world, but to the non-human, non-animal world. But thank you for the question.
Fascinating. Yeah. Lloyd, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful hour. Thank you for joining us. Well, and thank you for coming back to AAS to do this. And I hope we'll see you back here in person before too long, whatever you're working on next. I want to thank everybody who's been watching us here today. We have a variety of upcoming programs, the next of which is a conversation between Catherine Walkowitz and Lisa Brooks about Katie's new book, Reading Territory, Indigenous and Black Freedom, Removal, and the 19th Century State. That's a hybrid program, so it'll be both on site here in Worcester and live streamed, and that's on Thursday, April 6th at 7 p.m. Please check out the American Antiquarian Society website for other upcoming programs, much more coming up. Thank you so much. Thanks, Lloyd. Thanks to everybody who has joined us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you all sometime soon in person.